I'm gonna get the post for the bed from this piece of 12-quarter cherry. And the first thing I'm gonna do is cut it to rough length. Because this board is in the rough, the faces aren't exactly flat. So when I go to rip this board at the bandsaw, I need to make sure that I have the face down on the bandsaw surface that causes the least amount of rock. And you can see with this face down, it rocks quite a bit. But if I flip the board over, it's a lot more stable. So this is the face I'll have down at the bandsaw when I go to rip these posts. The two longer posts are going to make up the long headboard posts, and the third post is going to get cut in half to make two shorter footboard posts. With the freshly edge jointed faces against the fence of the joiner, I'll square and flatten one adjoining face. Before taking these posts over to the planer, I'm going to get them a little bit closer to their final dimension at the table saw, and I'm going to put one face jointed side against the table saw surface and the other face jointed side against the table saw rip fence. Now that I have two faces nice and flat and square to each other, I can plane the opposite two faces to thickness. I have all my bedposts planed to thickness and all of the faces are square to each other. The posts that are going to make up the footboard, the shorter posts, have sapwood in one corner. So what I like to do is place my joinery so that this corner ends up being in the interior portion of the bed and is more hidden. I think that'll look a little bit nicer. So this will be a joinery face and that'll be a joinery face. With all the posts dimensioned to thickness, I can square one end of each post and then cut them to their final length. I'm going to start working on the rails for the footboard and the headboard. And when I build beds, I like the rails to be pretty thick. So for this bed, they're going to be 1.5 inches thick. And to get that thickness, I'm starting with 8-quarter cherry. When buying lumber in the rough, it's always a good idea to check to make sure that the board doesn't have any checks. Now this one has a crack that runs from the end of the board up to around right here. So I'm going to cut this section off before I measure out for the rail. Now that I have all the boards cut to rough width, I need to flatten one face before I can plane them to their final thickness. Now, one board in the headboard and the board in the footboard are too wide for the capacity of my joiner. So they're going to overhang the joiner by a little bit, and that little smidge that overhangs the joiner, I'm just going to get with a hand plane. So after my first pass at the joiner, you can see where the joiner was hitting and where it wasn't because of the marks that I made on the board. So before I can take another pass, I need to get rid of this ribbon on the edge where the joiner wasn't able to get because the board is too wide. So in order to get this little section over here, I'm just going to use a hand plane. So after the second pass, the joiner was able to hit the entire length of the board with the exception of this one little section over here. So I'm going to hand plane this strip again and then take one more light pass of the joiner. I have all the rails dimensioned to thickness and width. Now I'm going to square one end, flip the board around, and cut them all to their final length. For the joinery for this piece, I'm going to use floating tenons. And in order to make the mortises in the posts, I'm going to use my horizontal mortiser. Both footboard posts are also going to receive 2 mortises for a split tenon. Now that I have the mortises and all the posts out of the way, I can start on the end grain mortises and all the rails. This material is going to make up the loose tenon stock. I'm going to put the freshly face jointed side against the resaw fence, and I'm going to resaw off a section that's a little bit over than a ½ inch, and I'll fine tune the thickness at the planer, and then I'll take it to its final thickness at the drum sander. Because I have ½ inch mortises, I need to round over the tenon stock with a 1/4 inch radius roundover. I only needed 2 of the wide tenons. The rest of the tenons are going to be for split tenons, and they're not as wide as this stock. So I'm going to rip off a section of this stock, and then I'll re-round over one side. So when making loose tenon stock, when you have different sized loose tenons, it's always good to start from your widest tenon if you're using the same material. Start with your widest tenon and you work your way down to your smallest size tenons. I temporarily assembled the headboard, and now I need to get the measurements for the stiles. And there's going to be one stile on either side of the panel. So in order to get that measurement, I'm going to take a piece of scrap wood and I'm going to rest it against the side of the post. And I'm going to contact the top of the headboard with the end of the piece of scrap wood, or sometimes this is called a story stick. And then I'm going to make a mark where the story stick meets the bottom of the headboard, and then I'll have the length of the stiles. So after I did that dry assembly, I realized that I made a small mistake with the top rail of the headboard. Because I'm going to arch the top rail in this direction, I made the mortise in this top rail too long. So if I were to make this arch and have it come down to where I wanted to, the mortise would actually show through from the top of the rail. So I can no longer arch the top rail in this direction. So because of that mistake, I'm going to arch the rail in the other direction, or concave instead of convex. So the arch will now start at the top in the corners and scoop down and then come back up to the top corner. So that way I can avoid the mortise on the end, and I think it'll still look cool. Now originally I was going to have the stiles be thinner than the rails to create sort of a shadow line between the rails and the stiles. But I thought about this some more and I decided to just go ahead and make the stiles the same thickness as the rails. Now if you downloaded the SketchUp file for the bed, you would have seen that. Oh, and by the way, the SketchUp file for the bed is now available to everybody. Originally the SketchUp file was only available to certain Patreon members, but I opened it up to everybody. Couple more passes should flatten this board nicely. Just a little bit of color right over here. So one more pass and that'll definitely do it for this board. Now that I have a flat face on the lumber for the stiles and its dimension to thickness, I can get a nice square edge on one side at the joiner and then I'll cut it to its final width. For the joinery for the stiles to the rails, I'm going to use floating tenons again. And to make the end grain mortises and all the stiles, I'm going to use my horizontal mortiser. Now if I don't move the height of the bit in the mortiser, I should end up with the rail and the stile flush with each other. Nice and flush. Now I need to make a groove along the inside of the stiles and the tops of the rails going all the way around to receive the panel, which I'll make later by resawing some cherry. Because my rails and stiles are so thick, I'm not going to put the groove for the panel exactly in the center of the headboard. It's going to be offset towards the front of the headboard by 1/2 inch. So the groove is going to start 1/2 inch back from the front face of the headboard. The groove for the panel in the top and bottom rail is going to need to start and stop before the groove reaches the mortises for the stiles. So I'm going to drop these pieces onto the spinning bit, and then when it reaches the end of the groove, I'm just going to turn off the router. For the panel, I'm going to resaw a piece of cherry that's just a little bit over 1 inch thick. So the board that I used for this book match was wider than the capacity of my joiner. So I had to overhang my joiner by a little bit, and that little bit of extra material I just got with a hand plane. I didn't go into detail when I was doing this because you guys have seen me do this a few times before, and I think in fact I did it on the very last video. So the next thing I'm going to do is get a nice straight edge on both of these mating surfaces, and then I'll glue these halves of the book match together. I've got my book matched panel out of the clamps, and a few passes through the drum sander will clean it up. I'm going to rip the panel to its final width now, and because I want to keep the line of symmetry in the center from the book match, I'm going to take the same amount of material off from each side. My panel is a little bit thicker than 1/4 inch, and the grooves that I use to receive the panel are 1/4 inch wide. So I'm going to use a rabbiting bit at the router table, and I'm going to make a rabbet all the way around the back side of the panel so that I can get the edges of the panel down to 1/4 inch. I just did a dry assembly of the panel inside the frame, and everything looks good. It's a nice fit. So the next thing I'm going to do is curve this top rail, and I'll do that at the bandsaw after I trace out a nice curve. So after using the oscillating spindle sander, I'm going to smooth this curve a little bit more by using a flexible sanding strip, which is nothing more than a piece of sandpaper adhered to a piece of flexible scrap wood. And I have the rail clamped in my DIY twin screw vise. Now this is a project that I made several years ago, and it's something that I use all the time. And if you go to my website, I have plans available for a small fee. At the router table, I'm going to use a 45-degree chamfer bit to put a chamfer on the tops of all the posts on all 4 sides. And I'm going to back up the cut with a piece of scrap wood to prevent chip out. Before I glue the footboard and the headboard together, I'm going to pre-finish all the pieces, and I'm going to finish it with General Finishes Armor Seal. Now I've used this finish before and I really like it, so that's what I'm going to use for this bed. With one face of each long rail flattened at the joiner and then both of them planed to thickness, I can square one edge at the joiner and then cut these to their final width. In order to connect the long rails to the footboard and headboard, I'm going to use this breakdown joinery, which consists of a latch side which connects onto this female side by latching onto it like that, and that's what connects the two together. Now, in order to use this breakdown joinery, you have to mortise each side into the components that are going to be joined. So this has to be mortised into the ends of the long rails, and this side has to get mortised into either the footboard or the headboard. In order to get these brackets to fit properly, I need to square off each end of the mortise, and I'm going to do that with a chisel. On the back side of the bracket, there's a little piece of metal that extends past the width of the main section of the bracket. And that corresponding amount of wood needs to be removed from the rail in order for the bracket to seat flush. Now, in order to get the location of that piece of metal on the rail, I'm just going to seat the bracket into the rail and then just give it a few taps on the back side of the bracket. And it should make enough of an indent to tell me where to drill with the Forstner bit. It's a little bit snug, so I'm going to adjust the fence on the router and take one more light pass. I need to make a mortise inside this mortise to receive the hooks of the male portion of the bracket. Now, I already traced out the opening for the female portion of the bracket, but when I mortise out this hole for the male portion, I need to make it a little bit longer than the opening is on the female side, because when the male portion goes inside the bracket, it actually slides down and hooks onto the female side. So what ends up happening is the male portion of the bracket extends down below the opening of the female portion. So when I make this mortise, I just need to make it a little bit longer. One thing I want to point out with these number 8 wood screws is that in order to get the heads of the screws to sit flush with the bracket, I had to grind them down a little bit at the grinder. Now, if you were to use a smaller sized wood screw, you might be able to avoid that. Now that I have the knockdown joinery out of the way for the rails, I need to round over all of the edges, and I'm going to do that at the router table. I need to work on the ledgers next, which are going to support the slats, which will support the mattress. And I'm going to get both ledgers from this one piece of cherry. I countersunk and pre-drilled for number 8 wood screws so that I can attach the ledger to the rail, and I'm using a couple of spacer blocks which are clamped down to the rail to help guide the position of the ledger as I'm pre-drilling into the rail. The next thing I'm going to do is work on the slats that will support the mattress, and I'm going to get all of those from poplar. I assembled the footboard and the headboard to the rails, and now I can mark for the length of the slats. In order for the slats to fit over the dowels, which are in the ledgers, I need to make a slot on each side of each slat. Now this serves to stabilize the slats underneath the mattress, and it keeps them from moving around. And I've used this method with the dowels on, I think, all of my beds, and I've been very happy with how it performs. As you can tell, the bed is finally finished, and I'll be extremely glad to finally get this bed out of my wood shop. It takes up an incredible amount of space, obviously. So to those of you that watched all 4 parts of this bed build, thank you for sticking around, and I really hope you enjoyed the series. So I might put on one more coat of General Finishes Armor Seal, and I think that'll do it. I'll bring it up to my son's room, and he can sleep on his new bed. Thanks for watching, guys.